Claire had heard the story so many times growing up that she could recite it word for word. Her father's business had failed quietly in his final years, buried under debt nobody talked about openly, which was why the family inheritance, when he finally passed, had been so much smaller than anyone expected. Her uncle Robert, who had managed her father's estate for the past 11 years, always told the story the same way, with the same tired sigh, the same phrase. There just wasn't much left after the debts were settled. Claire believed that story for 11 years. She stopped believing it the afternoon she found the original bank records in a box Robert had asked her to drop off at a storage unit, records that showed no debt had ever existed at all. What she found instead was a decade of numbers that told a very different story, one where the money hadn't disappeared into debt. It had disappeared into Robert's own accounts, one careful transfer at a time. By the time she closed that box back up, hands shaking slightly in the cold storage unit, she understood something that would take weeks to fully sit with. The uncle who had comforted her at her father's funeral had also, quietly and patiently, been stealing from that same funeral's grieving family for over a decade. What follows is the story of what she did next, not with rage, not with an immediate confrontation, but with a patience that took 10 weeks to fully unfold, ending in a way Robert never once saw coming. Claire's father had died when she was 24, after a short illness that gave the family just enough time to say goodbye, but not nearly enough time to prepare for what came after. Robert, her father's younger brother and longtime business partner, stepped in immediately to handle the estate, the business accounts, the property, all of it, exactly the way he'd always handled things when the family needed someone steady. Robert had always been the reliable one, the uncle who showed up early to help set up for every holiday, who remembered every birthday without being reminded, who Claire's father had trusted enough to make co-signer on the business accounts 15 years earlier, long before anyone imagined it would matter this much. When Robert sat the family down, 6 months after the funeral, and explained that the business had been carrying significant undisclosed debt for years, debt that would eat into most of what remained of the estate, nobody questioned it. Why would they? Robert had the paperwork. Robert had the calm, patient explanations. Robert cried at the funeral harder than almost anyone else in the family. This channel tells stories about betrayal that comes from the last place you'd expect, and the quiet, patient justice that eventually catches up to it. If that's the kind of story you're here for, subscribe now, because there's a new one every week. Claire, along with her younger brother David, each received a modest settlement, enough to help with a down payment on a small apartment, nothing close to what they'd assumed their father's decades of work had actually built. They didn't resent Robert for it. If anything, they were grateful he'd handled something so painful and complicated on their behalf, sparing them the burden of untangling their father's finances themselves while they were still grieving. Grace, Claire's mother, had been especially thankful. She told Claire more than once over the years that she genuinely didn't know what the family would have done without Robert stepping in so completely, handling every difficult conversation with the bank, the lawyers, the accountants, so that Grace herself never had to sit through a single one of those meetings during the worst year of her life. Robert had even organized the estate paperwork into a neat binder for each of them, complete with tabs and summary pages explaining, in plain language, exactly where the money had gone. It was, everyone agreed at the time, an extraordinary kindness from a man who had every excuse to simply hand the mess over to a stranger and step back from his own grief. Looking back, there had been small inconsistencies Claire simply hadn't thought to question at the time. Robert's new car, purchased about a year after the estate settled, nicer than anything he'd driven before, explained casually as finally treating myself after a hard year. A family trip to Europe Robert took 18 months later, funded, he'd mentioned once, by a small consulting contract that had come through. None of it seemed connected to anything. Robert ran a modestly successful consulting business of his own, separate from Claire's father's company, and it wasn't unreasonable that his own finances might simply be doing well on their own merits. Claire had no reason, at the time, to draw a line between her uncle's growing comfort and her father's estate, because the story she'd been told was airtight, complete, and delivered by someone who had never once given her reason to doubt him before. There was also, she'd realize much later, a specific kind of social cover that made those small inconsistencies even easier to overlook. Robert never flaunted anything. The new car was nice, but not flashy. The Europe trip was modest, a week in a mid-range hotel, nothing that screamed sudden, unexplained wealth. He was careful, in other words, in exactly the way someone hiding something would be, though Claire wouldn't understand that pattern for what it was until years later. The storage unit was supposed to be a simple favor. Robert was traveling for work and asked Claire to drop off a few boxes of old business records he no longer had space for at his office, records he described, offhandedly, as just old tax stuff, nothing exciting. Claire almost didn't look inside at all. She only opened the first box because one of the folders had slipped halfway out during the drive, spilling papers across her back seat. Sorting them back into order, a bank statement caught her eye, dated the year after her father's death, showing an account balance that didn't match anything she'd ever seen in the estate paperwork Robert had shown the family. She spent the next 4 hours in that storage unit, going through box after box under the fluorescent light, piecing together a financial history that told a completely different story than the one she'd believed for over a decade. The debt Robert had described, the one that supposedly consumed most of the estate, appeared nowhere in these original records. What appeared instead was a series of transfers, made steadily over roughly 10 years, moving money from the estate's actual accounts into accounts bearing Robert's name alone. By her rough calculation, sitting on the concrete floor with papers spread out around her, Robert had quietly diverted somewhere close to $400,000 from her father's estate, dressed up, year after year, as a debt that had simply never existed. She sat there long after the light outside had faded, unable to fully process that the uncle who'd cried at her father's funeral had also been quietly stealing from him, and from her, the entire time. The transfers themselves followed a pattern. Once she laid them all out chronologically, modest amounts at first, growing steadily larger over the years as apparently no one ever questioned them, moved just infrequently enough that no single transaction would have looked alarming to anyone glancing at it in isolation. It was, she would later tell the forensic accountant she eventually hired, almost impressively patient, the kind of theft that only works if the person doing it is willing to wait years for the full payoff. She also found, tucked into one of the later folders, a handwritten note in Robert's own writing, a rough draft of numbers that appeared to be an early version of the fake debt figures, complete with crossed-out amounts where he'd apparently adjusted the total upward more than once before settling on the final number he eventually presented to the family. That single piece of paper, more than any bank statement, made the deliberateness of the whole thing impossible to explain away as some kind of misunderstanding. Claire didn't drive home right away. She sat in the parking lot of the storage facility for almost an hour, replaying 11 years of family dinners, holidays, and casual conversations, all of them now recolored by a single, unbearable fact she couldn't unknow. Every time Robert had gently reminded the family how hard those years had been, settling your father's affairs, every time he'd sighed about the debt, every time he'd let Claire and David feel a quiet, grateful relief that he'd shouldered such a painful burden on their behalf, he'd known, the entire time, exactly what he was doing. The grief hit differently than her father's actual death had, all those years ago. This wasn't loss in the ordinary sense. It was the discovery that a decade of trust had been built on a foundation that never existed, that the version of her family's story she'd carried inside her for 11 years, the hard years, the sacrifice, the uncle who'd stepped up, wasn't true. She didn't call anyone that night. She drove home, sat in her dark apartment, and didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m, she found herself doing something she hadn't expected, quietly crying not for the money, but for the version of her father's memory she now had to hold alongside this new information. A man whose own brother had spent a decade profiting from his death while wearing the mask of the family's most devoted protector. She thought, too, about her mother, who still spoke of Robert with unguarded gratitude. who had leaned on him for advice through every difficult decision of the past 11 years, without ever suspecting that the man offering that advice had also been quietly draining the very estate he claimed to be protecting. By morning, Claire had made a decision she knew would be difficult to hold on to. She wasn't going to confront Robert with what she'd found, not yet, and not the way her first instinct wanted her to, calling him immediately and demanding an explanation over the phone. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that a phone call would give Robert exactly what he needed most: time to prepare an explanation, quietly move remaining funds, or destroy whatever records hadn't already been photographed. Whatever justice looked like here, it needed to be built on something more solid than her word against his in an emotional confrontation neither of them could take back. She photographed every page in that storage unit before returning the boxes exactly as she'd found them, careful not to let Robert know anything had changed. It was, she would say later, one of the hardest things she has ever done, sitting across from her uncle at a family dinner 3 days later, smiling, asking about his trip, while carrying a phone full of evidence that would eventually end his freedom. She told herself, repeatedly during those first difficult days, that patience wasn't the same thing as forgiveness. She hadn't decided to let this go. She'd decided, deliberately, that the version of justice she wanted required more discipline than a single furious confrontation could ever provide. Over the following 10 weeks, Claire did 3 things carefully, methodically, while maintaining an entirely normal relationship with Robert on the surface. First, she brought her brother David into the discovery, the only person she trusted completely with what she'd found. Together, they hired a forensic accountant, someone experienced specifically in estate fraud, to build a complete, professionally documented timeline of every transfer Robert had made over the past decade, cross-referenced against the fabricated debt claims he'd presented to the family. Second, she and David quietly consulted an estate litigation attorney, learning exactly what legal options existed, what evidence would hold up in both civil and potentially criminal proceedings, and how long a case like this typically took to resolve once formally filed. Third, and hardest of all, Claire continued attending family gatherings, continued calling Robert on his birthday, continued the exact rhythm of relationship the family had always had with him, while a legal case quietly assembled itself in the background. She later described this period as living 2 completely different lives simultaneously, one warm and familiar, one cold and precise, and never letting either one bleed into the other where Robert might notice. The forensic accountant, a methodical woman named Patricia who'd built her entire career on cases exactly like this one, warned Claire early on that the process would likely take longer than she wanted. Estate fraud spanning a full decade meant untangling hundreds of individual transactions, cross-referencing them against tax filings, bank records, and the original fabricated debt documents Robert had presented to the family years earlier. Claire told her, every time the timeline stretched further than expected, that she wasn't in any hurry. She'd already waited 11 years without knowing. A few more months, done properly, felt like nothing by comparison. David, for his part, struggled more visibly with the waiting than Claire did. More than once during those 10 weeks, he suggested simply confronting Robert directly and demanding he explain himself, convinced that faced with the truth, Robert would simply admit everything and make it right. Claire reminded him, gently but firmly, that a man capable of maintaining a lie for 11 years wasn't likely to unravel it in a single conversation, not without leverage strong enough to make denial impossible. There was one evening, about 7 weeks into the process, when Robert called Claire out of the blue, asking, in a tone that seemed almost too casual, whether she'd ever gone through with dropping off those storage boxes months earlier, and whether she'd happened to look through any of them. Claire's heart nearly stopped. She kept her voice steady, told him she'd dropped everything off exactly as asked, hadn't really looked at any of it, boring old paperwork, not really my thing. Robert seemed to accept the answer, moving the conversation along to something else entirely within a minute. She never found out exactly what prompted that question, whether Robert had simply been organizing his own records and noticed something out of place, or whether some instinct had quietly started nagging at him. Either way, that phone call confirmed something important. Robert had no real idea what she knew, but some small part of him hadn't fully forgotten those boxes existed. It was the closest her plan came to unraveling early, and it taught her to move even more carefully for the remaining weeks. After that call, Claire changed one habit permanently. She stopped discussing anything related to the estate, even in passing, anywhere near her own phone, moving every conversation with David or Patricia to encrypted messages or in-person meetings only, unwilling to risk a single accidental slip that might reach Robert before the case was fully built. By week 10, Claire and David had everything the attorney said they needed. A complete forensic accounting of the diverted funds, the original bank records proving no legitimate debt had ever existed, and a filed civil complaint ready to be served, alongside a referral already submitted to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. They chose to have Robert served with the civil complaint on a Tuesday morning, deliberately separate from any family gathering, specifically to avoid the kind of dramatic public confrontation Claire had decided, early on, that she didn't actually want. This wasn't about humiliating Robert in front of the family. It was about the truth being established clearly, legally, and undeniably, on paper that couldn't later be argued away with another calm, practiced explanation. David made one phone call that same afternoon to their mother, the only other person who needed to hear the truth directly from family before it became public through legal filings. Their mother, Grace, sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute after David finished explaining, then asked only one question: how long had Robert known they knew? Grace's second question, once she recovered enough to ask it, was whether Claire was certain, completely certain, before anything irreversible happened. Claire understood the question wasn't doubt in her. It was a mother trying to protect one more person she loved from a mistake that couldn't be undone. Claire told her, simply, that she'd checked the numbers herself, 3 times, with a professional, before ever telling anyone in the family at all. Grace was quiet for a long moment after that, then said something Claire would repeat often in the months that followed. That she wished, more than anything, that she'd trusted her own occasional unease about Robert's story over the years instead of dismissing it every time. Because some part of her, she admitted, had always found the timing of certain things a little too convenient to fully explain away. Robert was served at his front door on a Tuesday morning in October, a legal courier handing him an envelope containing 11 years of documented financial fraud, meticulously organized by a forensic accountant Claire had hired specifically because he had testified successfully in 3 previous estate fraud cases. He called Claire's phone 14 times that first day. She didn't answer any of them. He called David next, then their mother, each call reportedly more desperate than the last, alternating between explanations, according to what family members later described, that shifted depending on who he was speaking to. To Grace, he apparently claimed a misunderstanding about loans he'd always intended to repay. To David, he reportedly tried appealing to decades of family loyalty, asking how they could do this to him after everything he'd done for the family. Nobody in the family answered his calls with anything beyond a single, brief message from Claire's attorney. All further communication needed to go through legal counsel. 3 weeks later, facing overwhelming documented evidence and the very real prospect of criminal charges in addition to the civil suit, Robert's own attorney negotiated a settlement, full repayment of the diverted funds plus interest, structured over 4 years, in exchange for the family agreeing not to pursue criminal referral further, a decision Claire and David made carefully together. Weighing the additional years a criminal trial might take against simply recovering what had actually been stolen. Patricia, the forensic accountant, later told Claire that in her experience, cases this well documented almost never went to trial. Once the evidence was airtight enough, the accused party's own attorney typically pushed hard for settlement, precisely to avoid a courtroom record that would follow their client permanently. Robert's case, she said, was about as airtight as they came. The settlement negotiations themselves took place entirely through attorneys. Claire and David never once speaking directly to Robert throughout the entire 3-week process. The only communication that reached them personally came in the form of a single handwritten letter Robert mailed to Grace midway through, an apology of sorts that focused heavily on financial pressures from his own consulting business years earlier. Pressures he framed as the reason he'd first started. In his words, borrowing from the estate, always intending, he wrote, to pay it back eventually. Grace read it once and never mentioned its contents to Claire or David in detail again. The settlement fully repaid what Robert had taken, restoring, over 4 years, the inheritance Claire and David should have received from the beginning. Robert has not spoken to either of them since the day he was served, and according to Grace, has drastically scaled back contact with the rest of the family as well, appearing only briefly and uncomfortably at gatherings neither Claire nor David choose to attend anymore. Claire says the hardest part was never the money itself, even $400,000. It was rebuilding her ability to trust her own read of people, after discovering that 11 years of careful, consistent kindness from someone she loved had existed alongside an equally careful, consistent lie. What made the difference, she says now, wasn't confronting Robert the moment she found those bank records in the storage unit. It was the 10 weeks of silence that followed, the discipline of sitting across from him at family dinners, while quietly building a case strong enough that no explanation, however calm or practiced, could talk its way around it. Grace, Claire's mother, has since rewritten her own estate plan entirely, naming an independent trustee outside the family for the first time, a decision she made without anyone needing to explain why. Claire and David still see each other every week now, closer than they'd been in years, bonded by the 10 weeks they spent quietly building a case together while carrying a secret neither of them could share with anyone else in the family. Both of them agree, when asked, that the hardest part was never the confrontation itself. It was learning to sit at a dinner table with someone they loved, smiling, while knowing exactly what that smile had been hiding for over a decade. If this story reminded you that some lies take years to unravel, but eventually do, subscribe, because next week we're telling another story about the betrayal nobody sees coming, and the truth that finds its way out anyway. What would you have done? Confronted Robert the moment you found those records, or built the case first like Claire did? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes the truth that finally comes out isn't loud or immediate. It's the one someone spent 10 weeks quietly proving, one document at a time, until there was nothing left for a carefully practiced lie to hide behind.